Chapter 18, the Endocrine System. Okay, so Chapter 18 is going to cover the basics of the endocrine system. So the natural place to start is going to be, what is the endocrine system? Who is included in it? And then we can start talking about some more specifics. So the endocrine system is composed of any cell or tissue that produces hormones. And hormones are known simply as chemical messengers. They are going to help control and coordinate many of your body's processes. So this is going to include things like sleep, body temperature, and stress management. And we'll look at some examples of those as we get into the specific hormones. So there are some different methods of communication between cells, which is known as intercellular communication, so between the cells. There is direct communication, which kind of makes sense when you see this definition. This is when ions and molecules between neighboring cells go across gap junctions. Now you have to think back to Chapter 4 when we talked about tissues to remember gap junctions. So these are openings between neighboring cells. This allows cells to communicate and share with one another so that they can work as a team and not individuals, which is really what a tissue is. So direct communication is when two cells of the same type are going to pass information back and forth across gap junctions. So it's very direct. This is specialized and pretty rare. We then have paracrine communication, which is when chemical signals are going to transfer information from cell to cell within a single tissue. So chemical signals transferring information from cell to cell within a single tissue. So this is like talking by releasing chemicals. So they're talking to each other by releasing chemicals. Next we have autocrine communication, and this is when messages affect the same cell that secretes them. So the chemicals we're secreting here are called autocrines, and a great example of this would be the smooth muscle cell hormone called prostaglandin. So prostaglandin is released by the smooth muscle cell, and then in turn that prostaglandin affects that very same cell that secreted it, and essentially will cause contraction. And that again is specific for prostaglandin, which is a great example of an autocrine communicator. Endocrine communication, which is what we're focusing on in this particular chapter, is when we have endocrine cells that release hormones, which are chemicals, that will then be put into the bloodstream. The bloodstream will transport those hormones to different organs and tissues, and those organs and tissues will have an alteration in their metabolic activities. Now remember that metabolic means, or metabolism means the chemical reactions going on inside the body or cells. So hormones are going to alter those chemical reactions. Hormones are great because they're used to relay information and instructions between cells that are in distant portions of the body. So we can affect things with hormones that are not near wherever we release that hormone from. Now, in order to really understand how endocrine communication works, we do have to talk first about target cells. Target cells have receptors that are needed to bind and read hormone messages. So these target cells are specific cells in other tissues. So if we release a hormone and we really want that hormone to take effect once it enters the blood, that hormone needs to bind with its particular target cells in whatever tissue we sent the hormone to. So these target cells are really important because there's a mixture of hormones in the blood at any time, and we don't want the wrong hormones going to the wrong tissues. We want hormones to go to the tissues they are intended to go to. So by binding with these special target cells, this will ensure that hormones go to the right location and affect the right cells. So what this can do, if a hormone binds to its target cell, this can change what's going on in the cell. For example, it can change the type, the amount, or the activities of particular enzymes and proteins that are found in the target cell. So this can affect that cell's activity. It can also alter the metabolism or chemical reactions in multiple tissues and organs at the same time. So if we put a hormone into the blood that can affect multiple tissues, then we can expect that it will bind to those multiple tissues and affect their target cells simultaneously. So we can cause big changes at once. It also is going to affect long-term processes like growth and development. So as we're going through childhood and adolescence, obviously there are hormones that are being used for long periods of time, changing what we look like, how our body works as we go through different stages of development. So that would be long-term change. So you can classify any endocrine cell or tissue that produce hormones or paracrines to be part of the endocrine system. So again, any cell or tissue that produces hormones or paracrines would be considered part of the endocrine system. These cells are going to release secretions into extracellular fluid like blood, and endocrine organs are scattered throughout your body. So we're going to look at a selection of endocrine organs today. Some we're going to talk about later. For example, when we're looking at places like the intestinal tract, we're going to focus on those hormones when we get to that system. So there are some we're going to leave for later and some we're going to focus on today. So in this picture, we can see a few key endocrine glands or organs. So we have the hypothalamus, which is found at the base of the brain. We are going to talk about that one today. The pituitary gland, which is a really tiny gland that we will also talk about today. The pineal gland, found here. And then the parathyroid glands, which are found on the back of the thyroid. I'll show you those later. We've also got the thyroid, which we will talk about. Adrenals, which are located on top of the kidneys. Pancreas. The heart and the fat and the digestive tract and the kidneys we're going to save for when we get to those particular systems. And the gonads, which would be the testes and ovaries, we're going to talk about just a little today, but we're mostly going to save the details for that when we get to reproduction at the very end of the Anatomy 2 material. So the first thing we're going to do before we go into specific hormone types is we need to understand that hormones are classified into 3 primary groups. So the hormones we're going to talk about today are going to fit into one of these 3 groups. And the reason they're divided up, or what it's based on, is their chemical structure. So the 3 hormone groups are amino acid derivatives, peptide hormones, and lipid derivatives. So let's start first with amino acid derivatives. Amino acid derivatives are small molecules that are related to amino acids. Now, when we hear the words amino acid, we should think about protein. So these are protein-based, and they're very small, and this is going to include thyroid hormones, the catecholamines, which include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So those three guys together, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, those three are called as a team the catecholamines. So if you see the word catecholamine, you should think of those three guys there. And then also serotonin and melatonin. The peptide hormones are bigger molecules, and they are made up of chains of amino acids. They come in some different categories as well. So we have the glycoproteins, which have more than 200 amino acids in their chain, so they're longer. And these include TSH, which we'll talk about more later, but that's thyroid stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. Don't worry, we're going to define and explain what those hormones do in just a little bit. Right now, we just want to get the three categories straight. We also have under the peptide group the short chain polypeptides. So these would be ADH, which is anti-diuretic hormone, and oxytocin, or OXT. These are, and then we have the small proteins, which include insulin, growth hormone, and prolactin. So again, we will visit what each of those do in time in the chapter. Right now, we just want to understand that they all belong to the peptide group, which is also protein-based, but a little bigger and bulkier than the amino acid group. Okay, the lipid derivatives can either be eicosanoid or steroid. So let's start with the eicosanoids. Eicosanoids are derived from something called arachidonic acid, which is a fatty acid. So these are lipid or fat-based. And this is going to include paracrines that coordinate activities and enzyme processes like blood clotting. Some eicosanoids, like the leukotrienes, have secondary roles as hormones. And then prostaglandin is one we talked about before. Those are going to coordinate local cellular activities. So we talked about how prostaglandin can cause the cell it's secreted from to contract, which is typically going to go with smooth muscle. Steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol, so cholesterol can be a good thing. And these are going to include androgens from the testes in males, estrogen and progesterone from ovaries in females, corticosteroids from the adrenal cortex, which means the center of the adrenal gland, and calcitriol from the kidneys. Now, we did talk a bit about calcitriol back in chapter 6 of the Anatomy 1 material, so that should not be a totally new word for you. But again, we'll come back to what all these hormones do in just a bit. So the transport and inactivation of hormones. So how are they going to transport through the body, and then how will they become inactive after we've utilized them? So hormones are found in the body either freely circulating or traveling bound to a special carrier protein. Now, I know this is a bit lame, but I like to picture this. If you think of your bloodstream as like a lazy river going around, I picture hormones either jumping right in and floating around on their own. Those would be the freely circulating hormones. Or I picture them jumping into the lazy river on a little inner tube. And the inner tube they're going to attach to and float around is the ones that represent the bound to carrier protein type. So they can either jump in and float around by themselves, or they can float around on a protein, which I picture as like a little inner tube. Totally doesn't look like that, but that's just how I like to picture it. So the reason we separate these Free hormones, the ones that do not have a carrier protein taking them around the blood, these guys are shorter acting. So they're going to remain functional for less than an hour typically. And they will be inactivated when they either diffuse out of the blood and bind to the receptors on their target cells, which is the whole point of what they need to do. They'll also be inactivated if they are absorbed or broken down by the liver or kidneys, or they could even be broken down by enzymes in the blood or the interstitial tissue fluids. So those are ways that they're going to stop being effective. So free hormones are shorter lasting. Now, hormones that bind to a transport protein, they're going to stay in circulation longer, so they can have longer lasting effects. That's the big difference we're looking at there. So when a hormone gets to its target cell, what are the things that could potentially happen? Well, binding of a hormone can alter the genetic activity of the target cell. It can alter the rate of protein synthesis in that cell. So we're talking about transcription and translation, if you remember way back to Anatomy 1, Chapter 3. Or it could even change the membrane permeability of that cell. So those are some different options of big events that could potentially happen as a result of the binding of a hormone. So a hormone receptor is a protein molecule that a particular hormone can bind to strongly. Different tissues have different combinations of receptors, and the presence or absence of that receptor can determine how sensitive a cell is to a hormone. Well, that makes sense. If we don't have receptors for a particular hormone on that cell, then that hormone's not going to affect that cell. And this is good because you don't want weird hormones affecting weird places. We want the hormones that are designed for that particular tissue to get to that particular tissue. So no receptor, no sensitivity to it. Got to have those receptors. So remember that the goal of a hormone is to make it to its target cell and then create some kind of metabolic change or big event in that target cell. So when hormones get to their target cells, there's really one of two main ways we're going to talk about today that the hormone can affect the target cell. The catecholamines and the peptide group that we talked about previously, these guys are not lipid soluble. So if you recall, the plasma membrane of a cell is made of phospholipids. So these hormones are not lipid soluble, which means they cannot go across the plasma membrane. Since they can't go across the plasma membrane to get into their target cell, they're going to have to bind to receptors on the outside of the target cell. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in a figure in just a few minutes. Steroid and thyroid hormones, on the other hand, are lipid soluble. They are able to diffuse across the lipid membrane of the cell and bind directly to receptors in the cell. Okay, so these are two different ways. The top group can't get in, so they have to bind on the outside, and the bottom group can get in, so they can bind on the inside. So let's focus first on the group that has to bind on the outside. So this would be catecholamines and peptide group. Okay, so the catecholamines and peptide groups are going to have to bind to bind to receptors on the outside of the cell. That's called an extracellular receptor, meaning outside the cell. When the hormone binds to that receptor, we then call that hormone the first messenger. Remember, hormones are chemical messengers. So once that hormone binds, we then call him the first messenger. When the first messenger hormone binds to the extracellular receptor, this will promote the release of a second messenger in the cell. The second messenger is going to appear due to the hormone receptor interaction and may act as an enzyme activator or inhibitor, which will change the rate of metabolic reactions. So I'm going to show you this in a figure. It'll make it a little easier to understand. Some examples of second messengers are little c AMP, which is cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP, or calcium. Now, to help us out, which we're also going to see in our figure coming up in a second, we need a G protein. So the G protein is going to be the link between our first and second messengers. So here are the steps in increasing the second messenger level, cyclic AMP level, which will accelerate the metabolic activity of a cell. So the activated G protein will activate adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase converts ATP to cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP will function as a second messenger. Now, what the heck does all that mean? Well, let's look at it in this picture to see if we can make a little sense of it. So what you're looking at here is the plasma or cell membrane. Remember, we're talking about hormones that are unable to cross the target cell membrane. Remember, in order for a hormone to work, we need to get the message into the target cell. So here's our hormone that is unable to enter. So this maybe could be a catecholamine or a peptide hormone. So it's going to come to the target cell, and here's a receptor where it can bind. So the hormone binds. Here's our G protein. The G protein is going to be our bridge between the first and second messenger. It's inactive right now. As soon as the hormone binds, we call it a first messenger because it's carrying the message first. G protein is now activated and ready to pass the message in. So again, I know this is like, kind of lame and oversimplified, but I think that's good sometimes. If you can imagine the hormone has some directions, the hormone is standing outside the cell yelling, "Hey, here's what you should do." And on the inside of the cell is like, "What? I can't hear you." So the cell is going to use a second messenger to try to hear that message. Second messenger, being the guy who gets the message second, is going to carry that message into the cell. But the two, first messenger and second messenger, I like to imagine them as too far apart to hear each other. So we're going to use the G protein to be our middleman. G protein is going to help us get that message in to the second messenger, and then we're in business. Okay, so we left off here. Hormone binds to the outside protein. We now call it the first messenger. G protein is activated. So let's follow that down here. There's our hormone. It's bound. It's now a first messenger. G protein is activated. Okay, so that is going to cause an increased production of cyclic AMP. Remember, cyclic AMP is our second messenger. So the second messenger has now received the message. We pass it down like so. And now that the second messenger has received the message, something can now happen. We talked about some examples of big events. Maybe enzymes will be activated. Maybe ion channels will open. Maybe we'll start transcription and translation. The reason I'm not being specific is because we're not talking about a specific hormone right now, so we're just keeping it very broad and open. What you should understand right now at this point is how we use a second messenger and G protein to get our message into the cell for hormones that can't cross the membrane. So again, first messenger, G protein bridge, second messenger receives the message, and then the big event can occur. So again, we haven't said a specific big event, but that's okay. We're just talking about how we get that message in for now. Okay, so for steroid hormones are different. We said these guys can get through the plasma membrane, so they don't need second messengers or G proteins. This is going to be easier. They can alter the rate of DNA transcription in the nucleus. They can make alterations in the creation of enzymes or proteins, and they can directly affect the activity and structure of the target cell. So again, we don't need a second messenger or G protein for these guys. Thyroid hormones also can get right into the cell. We don't need a second messenger or G protein with them either. They bind to receptors within the nucleus and also on the mitochondria. So this is what makes thyroid hormones a little different, because they bind to mitochondria. So this is going to cause an activation of genes or changing the rate of transcription. It can also increase the rates of ATP production. When we think of thyroid hormones, we should think of ATP or energy levels, and so they are going to activate more energy production. So let's take a look at that in two pictures. So this one is going to go over our steroid hormones. So again, we're not giving a specific steroid hormone. We're keeping this general just so we understand how we get in. And then we're going to name some specific hormones after a bit. So here's a nameless steroid hormone. And as you can see, it diffuses right into the cell. So again, no second messenger or G protein needed. We can bind to a receptor in the nucleus, which would be here. This is our nucleus, so we can bind to a receptor in the nucleus, or we could bind to a receptor in the cytoplasm. So this is an either or thing, cytoplasm or nucleus, again, depending on the hormone. And this can cause gene activation, transcription, and translation, so we make new proteins. Okay, so that was our big event. We slipped right in, we bound to the cytoplasm or the nucleus, and that caused gene activation, transcription, and translation as an example of some kind of activity in the cell caused by a hormone. Thyroid hormones are a little different. Thyroid hormone can enter the cell as well, no second messenger or G protein needed. And with the thyroid hormone, we bind to a receptor in the nucleus, and this will cause, again, gene activation, transcription, translation. So that's all identical to our steroid hormone scenario. But here's the difference. We also bound to a receptor on the mitochondria. So this is not an either or, this is a both. We bound in the nucleus, and we also bind to a receptor on the mitochondria. And what this does is it increases ATP production. So ATP production goes up, we have more energy available. So let's focus in on some specific glands or organs at this point. So let's go with the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. The pituitary gland hangs inferior to the hypothalamus. I'll show you a picture, and is connected by what's called the infundibulum. It's going to release 9 important peptide hormones. So there's a little clue there, peptide hormones, which means these can't get into the target cell. So they're going to have to bind to receptors on the outside and use a second messenger and G protein. So specifically, we're going to be using, for these pituitary hormones, we're going to use cyclic AMP as the second messenger. So here's a picture of the pituitary up close. We've got the brain here, just to give you a scope. And then at the base of the brain, you can see this little gland hanging down. So if we blow this up, we're looking at the pituitary up close. Now notice the hypothalamus is right above the pituitary. We're going to talk about the hypothalamus next. It's kind of a big deal. But we're looking at the pituitary first. So there's a stem that hangs down, and this stem that attaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary is called the infundibulum. So that's our little stem. And then this is the pituitary, and it is nestled very tightly within the sphenoid bone, which is protecting it. As you can see, it's very well protected by bone, but it's a very important gland, so that's a good thing. The front of the pituitary is known, so this would be the part closest to your face. This is the anterior pituitary, and it has some regions of note as well. So right here in the front we have the pars distalis, and then we have the pars intermedia. This looks kind of to me like a wall that separates the front from the back, and the pars tuberalis, which is kind of a little stem that goes up here as well. The posterior lobe is back here, so that would be closest to the back of your head. The hypothalamus is a big deal because it regulates the function of the pituitary gland. I like to kind of think of it as the boss of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland can't really do anything without permission or direction from the hypothalamus, and that's in a few ways. The hypothalamus makes two hormones itself, ADH and OXT, which is antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The hypothalamus makes those and then transports them to the posterior pituitary for release. So the posterior pituitary doesn't even make its own hormones. It just serves as an exit point for those two hormones made in the hypothalamus. It also secretes what are called regulatory hormones that will control the activity of the anterior pituitary gland. So I kind of like to think of them as permission hormones. These hormones are going to basically direct when the anterior pituitary is allowed to release its own hormones. So again, hypothalamus is kind of the boss. It also contains a center that directly controls the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are the glands that are on top of the kidneys, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the adrenal medulla, the adrenal glands, the adrenal medulla specifically, is controlled by the hypothalamus. So we can see that in this figure. What we're looking at here is the pituitary and then the hypothalamus above it. And then over here is an adrenal gland. Remember, the adrenal gland is found on top of the kidney, so it's not up here by your brain. It's just in the picture so we can see the effect. So the hypothalamus makes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and those are sent to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland for release. So again, it's just an exit point. The posterior lobe doesn't make any hormones. The hypothalamus makes regulatory hormones that control when the anterior lobe can release its hormones. And what's interesting is the anterior lobe releases hormones that then control other organs. And the hypothalamus also exerts direct control over the adrenal medulla. Okay, so that's going to bring us to these two hormones, which we'll talk about later, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are made in the adrenal medulla. So the anterior pituitary is also known as the adeno hypophysis, and these hormones that are produced in the anterior pituitary, remember we just said they affect other endocrine glands or organs. And there's three regions of the anterior pituitary, which we already pointed out on the past slide. Remember the pars distalis or distalis, pars tuberalis, and the pars intermedia. The median immanence is a swelling near the attachment of the infundibulum. So let me go back and show you what that looks like here. So this is the median immanence going back this way. And this is where the hypothalamus neurons release regulatory hormones into interstitial fluids. The hormones then enter the bloodstream through fenestrated capillaries. This is going to allow these fenestrated capillaries, they're extra permeable. So this is going to allow large molecules to enter or leave the bloodstream. So that way, once we release a hormone, it can get into the blood quickly and on its way to the rest of the body or wherever it's directed to go. Okay, so this shows the regulatory mechanism of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, remember we said releases releasing hormones or regulatory hormones. I called them permission hormones. These give the anterior pituitary and other parts of the body permission to release their hormones. So an example of this is for the regulatory hormone, the hypothalamus can release TRH, which would regulate the thyroid. And so TRH being released would allow the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, to release TSH, which would then affect the thyroid gland. And TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So its name tells you what it's going to do. It's going to stimulate the thyroid. The thyroid can then release its own hormones. So it's kind of a chain event, starting with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus releases releasing hormone, which gives the pituitary permission to release TSH. TSH affects the thyroid, and we make thyroid hormones. CRH stands for corticotropin releasing hormones. So this is what the hypothalamus releases, and that allows the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. Again, we're going to talk about what that does soon. ACTH affects the adrenals. Then the adrenals can release their hormones. So you can see that no one can really make any moves until the hypothalamus gives its permission by releasing these releasing hormones. GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone, released by the hypothalamus, will affect the anterior pituitary again and allow it to release FSH and LH, which will affect the testes and ovaries. Then the testes and ovaries can release their own hormones. So again, nobody can do anything unless the hypothalamus says okay. So let's focus in on some of these specific hormones we've been naming and talk about what they do and who releases them. So the anterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is ACTH, prolactin, which is PRL, growth hormone, which is GH, and then gonadotropins, which are coming up next. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. Okay, so let's talk about what these top four do. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to cause secretion of thyroid hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to cause the secretion of glucocorticoids from the adrenals. Glucocorticoids include cortisol and cortisone, for example. Prolactin will cause the mammaries to produce milk, and growth hormone will cause, you guessed it, growth. Gonadotropins, again, are FSH and LH. FSH is very important too because it's going to cause the secretion of estrogen and also follicle development. We'll talk more about follicles when we get to reproduction, but they are essentially cells that surround an oocyte or an immature egg. Luteinizing hormone in females induces ovulation, which is the release of an egg, and stimulates the secretion of estrogen and progesterone. In males, it stimulates production of androgens. So we'll talk about those too. The pars intermedia, remember that little dividing wall that we looked at in that picture? It's going to secrete melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH. Melanocyte stimulating hormone will stimulate melanin production. If you remember from chapter 5, melanin is a brownish yellow to black pigment. Melanocyte stimulating hormone is pretty non-functional in adults, except pregnant women and in people with certain diseases. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is also called the neurohypophysis, and it, remember, is going to release antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and oxytocin, or OXT. Now, reminder that these are not produced in the posterior pituitary, they're only released there because they are actually produced in the hypothalamus. Antidiuretic hormone will cause kidneys to retain water, which will decrease urination. So this would be the opposite of a diuretic. It's going to help you to hoard water, especially when you are dehydrated. Oxytocin will stimulate contraction of the uterus during labor and also promote ejection of milk from the mammary gland after delivery. That brings us to the thyroid, which is inferior to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. So we haven't talked about the respiratory system yet, but when we get there, we talk about the thyroid cartilage. And the thyroid cartilage is what most people call their Adam's apple. So it's right below the Adam's apple and consists of two lobes that are connected by a narrow bridge called the isthmus. The thyroid is made up of follicles, which are little hollow bubbles or spheres lined by cuboidal epithelia. They're surrounded by capillaries, and each follicle has a cavity that contains a viscous or syrupy colloid. There are also some special cells to bring up called C cells, which I'll point out to you in some figures. So this is the thyroid. You can see the Adam's apple here, and then below the Adam's apple we have the thyroid, which has a lobe here, a lobe here, and then the isthmus connecting the two. There are also lots of blood vessels, as you can see, growing into the thyroid, which is great because that will allow hormones to get into the blood pretty fast. Okay, here is a microscopic view of the thyroid. You can see that in this thyroid slice that we have these spherical follicles, little kind of bubbles or little cavities filled with that viscous colloid. And around each follicle is epithelial tissue that is cuboidal in shape. So in looking at the follicle a little closer, we can see around the follicles are cells like this one and also this one called C cells. And C cells are going to help release another hormone, which we're going to bring up shortly. So thyroid hormones affect almost every cell in your body. They enter their target cells by transport system. Remember, we showed this in a previous figure. They do not need receptors, second messengers, or G proteins. They just go right into the cytoplasm. They bind in the nucleus and on the surface of the mitochondria. And remember, they're going to cause more production of ATP. In children, they're essential to normal development of skeletal, muscular, and nervous systems. So very important hormones. Remember that they activate genes involved in glycolysis and ATP production. So we're going to be making ATP as a result of thyroid hormones, which results in a calorigenic effect. So we have an increased energy consumption and heat generation of cells when thyroid hormones are active. It's responsible for strong, short-lived increases in rates of cellular metabolism. So remember cellular metabolism, the breakdown of glucose and production of energy in the form of ATP. C cells that we just pointed out a couple of slides ago produce calcitonin, which is abbreviated as CT. Calcitonin we did bring up back in Chapter 6 of Anatomy 1 content. Calcitonin is going to regulate calcium concentration in our body fluids. And what I mentioned back in Chapter 6 was the way I remember what calcitonin does, it's going to lower our body fluid calcium. And so the word calcitonin, to me, it kind of reminds me of the phrase calcitonin tones down blood or body fluid calcium. It's going to do this, it's going to lower our body fluid calcium by stimulating calcium excretion by the kidneys. So we're going to urinate out more calcium, and it's going to prevent calcium absorption in our digestive tract. So instead of absorbing calcium from our diet, we will let it go in the waste, which helps us to lower our overall calcium. Rather than absorbing it, we're letting it go. Parathyroid glands, there are two pairs, and they're found on the posterior or back side of the thyroid. They produce PTH, or parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is going to be released when our blood calcium levels are too low. So they're going to do the opposite of calcitonin. Calcitonin toned blood calcium down. PTH is going to raise it when it's too low. So looking at the back of the thyroid, you can see these four little jelly beans. Those are the parathyroid glands. So what they will do to raise our blood calcium, one, they're going to stimulate osteoclast. So again, you got to think back to Anatomy 1, Chapter 6. Osteoclasts secrete enzymes to dissolve bone. And when we dissolve away at the bone, we release calcium out of it. So if we stimulate the osteoclast, this will accelerate the release of calcium from the bone, which will raise our blood calcium. It will cause us to absorb more calcium in the kidneys, so we don't lose it in the urine. Stimulate the formation and secretion of calcitriol by the kidneys. So calcitriol is actually going to help us to reabsorb more calcium in our small intestine. So if we release calcitriol, we're going to suck up calcium even more from our diet, which is going to cause our blood levels to go up. Adrenal glands are found on the superior border of each kidney, so they sit right on top of the kidneys. The superficial adrenal cortex, so the outside of the adrenal gland, stores lipids, specifically cholesterol and fatty acids, and manufactures steroid hormones like corticosteroids. The inner adrenal medulla, which is our focus right now, is going to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are two of the catecholamines that we mentioned previously. So in this picture here, we can see the adrenal glands. right on top of each kidney. They kind of look a little bit like grape-like clusters, sort of a reminder also of how the pancreas has that same kind of look. So looking at epinephrine and norepinephrine, so the adrenal medulla, or the center of the adrenal gland, there are two kinds of cells in it. One type produces epinephrine, which is abbreviated as E, or EPE. You see it like that sometimes too. 75 to 80% of the medullary secretion of the adrenal medulla is epinephrine. The other produces norepinephrine, or NE, which is 20 to 25% of the medullary secretion. Both epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to increase cardiac activity, blood pressure, sugar breakdown, blood glucose levels, and release lipids from the adipose tissue. So it's going to basically raise a lot of your of the body processes we just mentioned. Sometimes these are referred to in lay terms as adrenaline. So this is released when your body is going to act at its best physically. And a lot of times this is released in sympathetic situations like fight or flight scenarios. So the activation of the adrenal medulla, again in skeletal muscles, epinephrine and norepinephrine will trigger mobilization of glycogen, which is a stored glucose. And we're going to then accelerate the breakdown of glucose. In adipose, stored fats are broken down into fatty acids, and in the liver, glycogen is broken down. In the heart, stimulation of receptors will speed and strengthen cardiac muscle contraction, so heart rate will go up. The pancreas is a large gland that lies in the loop between the inferior border of the stomach and the proximal portion of the small intestine, and contains exocrine and endocrine cells. So here is the pancreas. Again, grape-like clusters. These little grapes are called the islets of Langerhans. You can see a duct running through the pancreas, and that duct is what the pancreas uses for exocrine functions. Exocrine functions we will talk about in the digestive chapter, so we're not going to worry about those now. The endocrine functions are the ones we want to focus on. But you can see the pancreas does kind of snuggle up to the small intestine right here. Now the cells that we're focusing on today are these two, the alpha cells and the beta cells. So the alpha cells produce glucagon and the beta cells produce insulin. So when blood glucose levels go up, the beta cells secrete insulin, which helps to lower your blood sugar. It's going to stimulate the transport of glucose or sugar into the target cells. So we'll get it out of the blood. When blood glucose levels decrease, alpha cells secrete glucagon, which will cause glycogen breakdown and glucose release by the liver. So that's going to make blood sugar go up. So going into that a little more, insulin is a peptide hormone released by the beta cells. The effects on the target cells are, we're going to take up glucose, we're going to accelerate its use and enhance ATP production, and we're going to stimulate glycogen formation for storage. This will get it out of the blood, so it will lower the blood sugar. Glucagon is released by alpha cells, and it helps to mobilize energy reserves. It will affect the target cells by stimulating breakdown of glycogen in skeletal muscle and liver, stimulate the breakdown of triglycerides in fat cells, and stimulate the production and release of glucose in liver cells. So again, raise your blood sugar. Finally, the testes and ovaries. And again, we're not going to say much about these now because we have reproduction and pregnancy later on in the Anatomy 2 content. But the testes are going to produce androgen, and testosterone is one of the important androgens to focus on. There are also nurse cells in the testes that support the creation and maturation of sperm cells. The ovaries produce estrogen, and after ovulation, the follicle cells release estrogen and progesterone. Androgens in males, estrogens in females, can stimulate cell growth and differentiation in target cells. And not only that, we said that the androgen is going to help with sperm production and also give men the physical characteristics that are inherently male. It can affect skeletal proportion, body hair amounts, and muscle mass. In females, estrogens are going to help with the female cycles and also the secondary sex characteristics like fat deposition on the hips and thighs, less body hair, lower muscle mass as compared to that in the stimulation of testosterone. So hormone changes can definitely affect behavior, the ability to learn and remember things, and also your emotional states if your hormones are off. There are a few functional changes that occur with age, but reproductive hormones do decline as we age, and some endocrine tissues become less responsive to their stimulation. So this concludes Chapter 18, an intro to the endocrine system and major hormones, and we'll see you in Chapter 20 for the cardiovascular system next.